On behalf of CPE, Bay Resistance, Arab Resource and Organizing Center, and the Anti-Police Terror Project, welcome to Palestine Solidarity Announcements. If you're new to PSAs, these calls are a space for us to provide weekly updates on what's happening in Palestine, the most recent calls to action, and ways you can join the ongoing solidarity work for Palestine in the Bay Area. Last night, the President's State of the Union address started late because protesters took to the streets to block traffic and call for ceasefire. Joe Biden's address to the American public and to the world shared no firm commitment or timeline to end the bombing in Gaza. Instead, he proposed more military intervention, this time the U.S. Armed Forces building a temporary pier to provide more aid to starving thousands across Palestine. Notwithstanding the confusing logistics of this kind of construction and the attendant dangers of more explicit U.S. military presence in the area, and we know they have already been on the ground to support and take part in the mass killings, we know that the U.S. has a far more straightforward path to relief: stop funding and arming this war. Even more, the U.S. has displayed neither the competence nor the care to deliver aid in a trustworthy manner, as evidenced by the airdrops that landed in the sea earlier this week, and those that malfunctioned and killed at least 5 Palestinians earlier today. Genocide Joe, as Manadal Herzala aptly described him during last week's PSA, has been front and center throughout this week, including throughout the events of Super Tuesday, which we saw a continuation of interventions at the polls, including and especially thousands of uncommitted voters across several states. Electeds are continuing to feel the heat where they campaign, with scores of protesters disrupting fundraisers, campaign visits, and the offices of seated candidates, including and especially here in the Bay Area. One very important action of resistance that is taking place today in just under an hour is the International Working Women's Day March that will be starting here in the Bay Area at the San Francisco Civic Center. In the spirit of the first women's strike in New York City in 1908, the organizers of this march will unite us in upholding the legacy and power of women's resistance here and in Palestine, and demand an end to the inhumane genocide that is being funded by our US tax dollars. And we encourage you, if you can, to join that march as soon as we complete today's call. Today's agenda is as follows. Our comrade Melissa Fan is actually working at the march today, so instead of semantics grounding, we are going to have Maisa Morar from the Palestinian Feminist Collective and one of the main organizers of today's march join us to tell us about the significance of this action and its focus on Palestinian resistance this year. Then, and as always, Samer Arabi from AROC will share updates and analysis on political developments internationally and in the US. This week, we have 2 special guests to share some insights on one aspect of the ceasefire negotiations: political prisoners and hostages. Ziad Abbas from Mecca will join us once again to talk about the information still possible to gather about what's happening on the ground and to give some insight into how Palestinians in Palestine might view the question of prisoner releases and exchanges. Finally, Nathaniel Moore from Freedom Archives will share information about the infrastructure of incarceration and imprisonment of political prisoners. Thanks again for joining us today, and please keep up the fight for Palestine. And with that, let's bring up Maisa Morar from Palestinian Feminist Collective to talk with us about today's march.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me on here today. I'm right now in front of the Civic Center. We are getting ready for our International Working Women's Day March. I'm a part of the Palestinian Feminist Collective. And this year in particular, we are centering Palestine, Palestinian women, Palestinian resistance as we march in the streets of San Francisco. And as we also use today to utilize our whole shutdown framework. So we want to shut down, in particular, PFC has a campaign to shut down colonial feminism. And so what does that mean really? When we talk about feminism, the colonial feminism is the kind that exceptualizes feminism and uses that as a tool of gendered violence in order to continue colonization and to continue their imperial forces, especially in Palestine. So in particular for us as Palestinian women and as international people of the world, we are here to stand against that We are here. We started at the Civic Center and we're planning to march about 1.5 miles down to the Women's Building for the significance of being in Valencia and also taking back to power our streets and the gentrification that our workers and our migrants face here in the belly of the beast. And so we welcome you all to join us today. I hope that people on this call can come out. We plan to start at around 1:00 p.m. March will probably go up until, or the program will end up until about 4:30, 5:00. So if you can come and march with us, you're more than welcome. If you're not really able to walk all the way through, then you can meet us by the Women's Building on 18th and Valencia, and you can catch part of the programming there too. Yeah, if anyone has any questions or anything, I'm happy to answer for you.
Thanks so much, Maisa, and for all your work in organizing today's march. Again, if you have some questions, Maisa, if you can stick around maybe for a few minutes, if we have questions in the Q&A, we'll send them over to you. And then otherwise, we'll let you go soon afterwards to get back to organizing. So thank you again.
Great.
All right, with that, Samra, let's bring you up and let's talk about what has turned out to be quite an eventful week again, but also particularly on the front of electoral struggle. And we hope that you can give us some context, give us some updates, and maybe share some graphs. I don't know if you have any visuals to share us today that'll help us understand what's going on, but appreciate you coming on board again to do this.
Thanks so much, Thomas. It's great to be here. And Thomas knows that I'm constantly doofing around on Excel and making charts for no reason. So indeed, I do have charts. There's as always a lot to cover this week. So I'll just jump right into it. As usual, I'll start with what's happening in Palestine, and then zoom out a little bit to talk about the broader political developments around what's happening in Palestine, and then close out with some mobilization updates locally. So just jumping right into it, I always start with a quick overview of the death count and the destruction count in Gaza. And I just want to make a note here that as the sort of tactics of forced starvation and deprivation continue to escalate, these numbers are going to become increasingly unreliable because they are largely based on direct military casualties, whereas now we're seeing similar numbers dying for humanitarian reasons. So they were always a drastic undercount, but the extent of the ongoing violence is being obscured by the fact that Israel is now killing people largely not with bullets and bombs, but through starvation, malnutrition, and disease. On that, very grim note, the looming question of the moment is Rafah, the city on the southern tip of Gaza that borders Egypt, where over 1 million displaced Palestinians are now, seeking shelter after Israel told them that that was the only place that they could go. Rafah has been bombed regularly, but the question now is whether a ground invasion is imminent. The threat made by the Israelis and by Netanyahu in particular is that Rafah will be invaded by the start of Ramadan, the Muslim holy month of fasting, if no agreement has been reached. And we'll come back to this in more detail later, but just to say that it's extremely, extremely unlikely that there will be a ceasefire agreement before the start of Ramadan, which will be this weekend or Monday. So the question is now, what are they going to do? And, we've spoken in past weeks about the extent to which this saber rattling, escalatory rhetoric is a way for them to push for a ceasefire that they need, that they don't feel very comfortable doing a ground invasion in Rafah, and we're about to find out. If they do go forward with it, it would obviously be an unimaginable humanitarian catastrophe. And an important moment, I think, to note, one of the ways that even the small victories we get at the legislative level often sort of come back around in ways that end up being useful. So if you remember, we talked a few weeks back or maybe you saw in the news that Biden had issued a new like memorandum around all military aid requiring some basic level of vetting to make sure that it's not being used to commit crimes like human rights violations. Now a large group of Democratic senators are pushing the administration to require that exact framework to be applied to what's happening in Rafah. So a lot of high-level, frankly, very moderate Democrats have been pushing for this. So we'll see if that has any impact. It's again a little early and a little hard to know, but you know, all eyes are on Rafah for the next 3 days. And if they do start the ground invasion, they're likely to do it in a way that tries to escape notice. So please do pay attention this weekend. In addition to the military campaign, there is the ongoing forced starvation efforts. To the extent that, you know, this is now itself coming up in front of the International Court of Justice as what South Africa calls correctly genocidal starvation, the idea that, you know, the extent to which malnutrition and starvation continues to be like is a growing issue in Gaza is clearly an attempt to sort of collectively punish the entire population of Gaza. And you know, last week we spoke about the flower massacre, and just to note, because it hasn't really been making the news, that it's already happened again twice since that first flower massacre. It's not the same level of violence, but you know, repeatedly now when aid trucks are going in, Israelis are shooting at Palestinians who are trying to get the aid from those trucks. And just to say that, you know, now that the news cycle has moved on and the media is starting to investigate, they are finding that Israel's claims that, you know, people died because of a stampede are totally unwarranted. Like overwhelmingly, the deaths are from gunshot wounds, unsurprisingly, from the original flower massacre. So that brings us to the ceasefire negotiations and where they're at. And the short update on where they're at is they are not moving. So the last round of negotiations were happening in Cairo. And this was a round that Israel was not even participating in. But there was hope that like there would be some sort of broad agreement that could bring Israel back to the table, and that did not happen. So the big difference here, and this, you know, goes back to the, you know, Thomas and I were speaking last week about how the word ceasefire is becoming a little bit muddied, and people are using it to advance very different political agendas. So, you know, now you're seeing Biden talk a lot about wanting a ceasefire, but saying, you know, like it's in Hamas's court, like it's on them to accept it or not. But in reality, they're not offering a ceasefire. They're offering a 6-week temporary truce that would require all of the military hostages that that Hamas is holding to be released. And Hamas is saying, no deal unless there's a permanent ceasefire and a full removal of Israeli forces from Gaza. And so loggerheads, you know, there's basically no movement on this. There's a lot to say about it, and maybe in a future conversation we can dig into more about the underlying motivations of the different sides for where they're at. But just to say that for the moment, Hamas does not seem to be moving significantly from the demand of a permanent ceasefire, and Israel has not yet moved from its, you know, continuing expectation of an ongoing military campaign in Gaza, even though it's becoming prohibitively costly for them. We are seeing a sort of change in discourse around ceasefire at the administration level. We heard it again last night at the State of the Union. And just to note that, you know, Kamala Harris is now actively using the word ceasefire, but again, it's really important to note that they're using it in a way that's different than the ways that like the whole anti-war movement has been saying ceasefire for the past 5 months, which is not ending the conflict, but a quick pause. And, you know, just to note that like this 6-week pause that both Israel and the United States are pushing for is critical for 2 kind of core underlying reasons. One, domestically, because basically every Democratic primary that is left would be within these next 6 weeks. I think the only big swing state primary outside of that window is Pennsylvania. So there's a desire to sort of, as this protest vote continues to grow, which is something we'll talk about a little bit in a moment, the Biden administration is freaking out, right, with the reelection campaign. So I think they want a sort of temporary de-escalation to bring the electoral pressure on Biden down. But more importantly, internationally, these 6 weeks overlap directly with Ramadan, which historically is a time with a lot more focused attention on Palestine and generally where like the possibility of instability in the region can really increase. So there's fear that if this military campaign continues to run through Ramadan, it will become increasingly unstable and will incur increasing wrath from like the entire 1 billion plus Muslim world. So I think both the US and Israel really don't want to be stuck in a military confrontation during Ramadan, which is why, again, it's not really clear what's about to happen in Rafah. I would really recommend, by the way, we always send these slides out afterwards, checking out this article by Phyllis Bennis, who is a wonderful analyst on all things Palestine, who talks about like, the difference between the administration's rhetoric and actions and how we can understand why the administration is changing its rhetoric. The last like big US move that I wanted to talk about briefly is just these bizarre aid shipments that Biden has been prioritizing. First, a series of airdrops. I think yesterday was the third, each of which is 30,000 meals, I think. And when you consider, I used to work in humanitarian aid delivery, and I can tell you definitively that these airdrops are spending maybe 10 times, probably significantly more than 10 times the value of the food on the logistics around it. I mean, it's an absurd way to deliver humanitarian assistance. Not to mention that, for the, I don't know how many millions of dollars they spent doing these airdrops, they've provided 100,000 meals, for a population of 2.2 million who require multiple meals a day. Like I don't want to say it's nothing. Obviously, every bit of food is valuable, but an absolutely absurd and wildly inefficient way of delivering assistance, particularly when there are roads all the way through Gaza that are just being blocked by the Israeli authorities. And so the United States could, if it wanted to, push for those roads to be open. They're just choosing not to and instead doing these bizarre stunts. The new thing from Biden's State of the Union last night, and again, his attempt to sort of salvage his reputation around the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, is this idea of a temporary pier in Gaza, which is again a really absurd and wildly inefficient way of delivering aid, but also like raises a series of complicated questions around the continuing escalation of the conflict, right? How is that pier going to get built? It's going to be built by like US soldiers who will have to be on the ground. That itself represents a series of risks. It's a sort of ongoing manifestation of a fight, a soft fight between the US and Israel, where Israel, backed into a corner, not knowing how to continue this campaign that it is losing, is resorting to like the darkest of tactics, which is just starvation, to force, some sort of like, to improve its hand, given that it's failed militarily. The US doesn't want it to play out that way, but it does want Israeli ascendancy. So you're seeing a bit of a conflict there over how they're managing the process. And obviously, the idea of building a pier to get around Israeli checks is a way of saying, that they have differing opinions on how to handle Gaza, but they're both atrocious. They're just different opinions. One is, yeah, do it with the military, and now Israel's position is more like, nah, just starve them out. Through all of this and through all of Biden's, talk about the catastrophe in Gaza and the human suffering and the need for aid, they continue to supply an unimaginable quantity of military hardware. A new report this week showed that what the Biden administration has been doing is breaking down military shipments to Israel into small enough chunks that they don't have to be reported. So they like fall below a reporting threshold. So you can see there are 600 active cases of potential military transfers or sales worth $23 billion. And so far, since October, there have been 100 separate shipments of military assistance, literally just to avoid oversight and transparency. So like this is ongoing while Biden is saying Israel can't, block assistance. But like if he was serious about them not blocking assistance, he could just cut off this giant, totally unaccountable supply of weapons. And it's worth noting that this is a thing that broadly the American populace agrees with. So for Biden's voters, at a margin of 4-1, they think that the U.S. should stop sending weapons to Israel until it stops attacking Gaza. 4-1, right? There are very few things that people feel that strongly about. And interestingly, for undecided voters, it's also 3-1, 60% to 17%. And yet, we're seeing literally zero movement on this from the Biden administration. We are seeing movement on it from other Democrats, but that's a conversation unto itself. I always take a minute just to talk about the aid bill that continues to flounder in the House and Senate. This week's update is that the House passed an aid bill to Israel for $14.3 billion, and did it in like the sort of typical Republican way, which involved gutting the IRS and a series of other domestic social services to provide more weapons to Israel. And like, as bizarre as that is, and it will never pass the Senate, it's also worth noting that 12 Democrats voted for it. And I feel like this like sentence from one of the Democrats, Don Davis in North Carolina, is really telling. He says, "While I condemn House leaders for unprecedentedly tying conditional funds to security assistance, we must stand together with our ally Israel." So like, even though this bill goes against everything else this person stands for, he's still voting for it, which just goes to show the extent to which all Republicans and a good chunk of Democrats are just like totally beholden to the sort of AIPAC narrative, even when it goes against their own principles and interests. The last like broad political development I wanted to touch on quickly is just Super Tuesday, or like the primary elections generally. There's a little bit of good news and a little bit of bad news. We'll start with the bad news, which is that, primaries are generally low voter turnout events, and this one was particularly low. Just looking at California, you can see here on the right, 7% of ballots had been returned. This is from end of February, so it did go up from this number, but just to say, 15% turnout for senior citizens, people over 65, and 2% turnout for people who are 18 to 34, who are generally both the most progressive, but also the most anti-war. And so as a result of that, you can see here AIPAC bragging that 100% of AIPAC endorsed Democrats won in the primary election. And that includes, of course, our dear new senator-to-be, Adam Schiff, who was strongly AIPAC endorsed and pushed out a series of pro-ceasefire candidates. But there's a lot we can say about Adam Schiff another day. But I do want to note that this idea of 100% AIPAC endorsed Democrats on the ballot one is just flat out not true. It continues to be part of this like, disturbing narrative of just like making things up and running with them. As a really key example here, the two Democrats who were battling to take over Katie Porter's seat in California, for reasons that nobody fully understands, AIPAC spent $5 million against this guy, Dave Min, just for one congressional House seat. And Dave Min isn't even like a outspoken anti-Zionist. He's basically said nothing about Israel one way or another. And yet they've spent $5 million to try to unseat him, and they lost. So just to say, don't trust AIPAC. And then on to the good news, such that it is the uncommitted vote, that started in Michigan that we talked about last week, has been rapidly exploding. So just to say, like, it has been a massive movement across primary elections in a way that I think is terrifying the Democratic Party. And, you know, we saw in Michigan, the percentage of people who voted uncommitted was almost 20%, which was extremely high and way more than the people there who had been, you know, they had only spent about a month organizing, were expecting to get. So that's really remarkable. But after that, you know, in Minnesota, they had a week to organize an uncommitted vote, and they got almost 30% of the vote. Well, sorry, that's all people who didn't vote for Biden. So in Michigan, it was 13% actually who voted uncommitted. In Minnesota, it was 20% who voted uncommitted. And then just a couple days ago in Hawaii, it was 29% who voted uncommitted. And so this is one of the charts that Thomas was referencing that I like to play around with. So I just looked at what percent of votes Obama lost when he was an incumbent running for re-election. So like what percent of people didn't vote for Obama in the primaries versus what percent of people didn't vote for Biden in the primaries. And you can see the difference is huge, absolutely huge and growing. So as you can imagine, I think it is something terrifying for the Democratic establishment. And I do think if this continues, we're going to see continuing shifts in the way that they're approaching the situation in Gaza. Like this whole, you know, aid corridor stuff wouldn't be happening without this shift. And even though it's still not enough, it is movement. And I think we're going to continue to see that movement while Biden is worried about his re-election prospects. So that closes it out. Just to say, as always, please take a moment to support students who are being attacked for standing up for ceasefire. Take a moment to support the folks who are arrested for blocking the Bay Bridge, demanding a ceasefire. My third bullet point here used to be the primary elections, but that's over. So thank you for presumably doing that. If you want to stay involved, make sure to check out AROC's calendar of events at bit.ly/Gaza events. And if you want text alert updates, just send PSA to the number below. That's 833-633-0604. And then thanks for everybody who signed up for the media tracker. We are now sending weekly digests of the news. And so everything that you've seen me cover today, plus a lot of other things, would be included there. It goes out every Friday morning. And we now have featured articles at the top of the media tracker. So if you do have feedback on how that's working, please don't hesitate to let me know. And thank you all so much. It's a pleasure to be here. And hopefully I'll see you at the Women's March later.
Thanks, Samer. Yes, sobering news about the primaries, but also appreciate the charts and the visuals, and curious about what that bodes for Biden's prospects moving into the remainder of these primaries. We're going to move now to bringing up Ziad Abbas from Mecca and talk a little bit more about what's happening in Gaza, and then also talk a little bit about the idea of prisoner releases. Ziad, it's been several weeks since we've had you on the PSA. It's good to have you back and appreciate your time. And we know you're doing quite a lot. And since we last talked, the situation on the ground has deteriorated significantly, as Samer mentioned. And we're hearing less and less from Palestinians on the ground in the mainstream media. My first question is just, have you been able to sustain contact on the ground in Gaza? And if you can give us a sense of what you're hearing about how conditions are at the current moment.
Thank you for having me. Yes, and thanks for Samer, actually. He was doing the update. It was amazing. Yeah, we are still in touch. We are able to communicate with our staff members and with our partners in different parts of Gaza Strip. Still, the north of Gaza is the most difficult situation, where the mass starvation hitting very bad. And I heard about Samer that he did some updates about the airdrop, the food, and unfortunately, actually, I don't know if he mentioned that. I came late a little bit, but there were 5 people already killed as a result of that. 3 from the same family and other 2 because the parachute didn't open, so it was hitting on the people. So 5 people actually killed, not just by the American bombs, by the other airdrop hit very bad. Situation is really getting hard in the north, especially about the mass starvation. I used to say that death is knocking every door in Gaza Strip, and now death is knocking every stomach in the north of Gaza. where people start dying. And recently, the number increased to 20 people. They were killed in Gaza as a result of that, because a lack of milk, a lack of food, a lack of water. Even inside the hospitals, they don't have enough food to feed these children. On the other hand, that the people, they are dependent on the very, very, very limited resources inside the north of Gaza, including the plants. People, they go around and collect the plants and cook it. And when we speak about babies, many moms, they are not willing to produce milk and breastfeeding their children. And this is one of the results why these babies, they are dying as a result of the mass starvation. And by day, the number will be doubled. If the people, they will not be access to this, to the food, it will be doubled. At the same time, Israel is still targeting the areas where people in the north, like what we call it, Duwar and Nabilsi, or a Nabilsi circle, where sometimes some of the trucks that the Israeli allowed in coordination with the United Nations or any other international organization to meet there, so the people, they can go there. But while the people, they are waiting, they are targeted. The last time they were targeted, actually yesterday in Gaza. Still getting very difficult, especially north of Gaza. Doesn't mean that the middle area and the south area, Rafah, and the numbers, it's increased of the people day by day. We are close now to 31,000 almost people killed. And actually, the whole number of the people, they were killed in Gaza since October 7th until now, reaching 40,000, because we are close to 8,000, over 8,000 people still under the rebels of the destroyed houses in different part of Gaza Strip. The trucks, they allowed last 2 days some trucks to enter, which was good, but it's not good enough at all. And because we need at least 500 trucks per day to get to Gaza in order to deliver. But I can say for our service as Mecca, what we can do, we are still able to function. We have our kitchens in Rafah area. We have major kitchens, like 2,500 hot meals we can distribute there. And we have other small kitchen led by women where they cook and they distribute. The same in Al Mawasi area, actually. We used to have a big kitchen there, can serve like 2,000 hot meals a day. It was bombed and destroyed. We still have other kitchen actually working in the middle area, like in Deir al-Balah, like in Lebrage and Nusayrat. We try to do the work there. In general, it's getting bad day by day. The increasing of the number of the people, they are dying, the people, they are injured, almost 72,000 people, they are already injured. They speak about 12,000 injured people. They need to be evacuated from Gaza to another hospital because nothing to help them or to do anything for them. We speak about 12,000 injured people. These people, they need to go to other hospital outside of Gaza Strip. It's not possible to treat them. So what they try to do right now, only basic support for these injured people. Yeah, and I can spend a lot of time to speak about the details about the situation of Gaza, but still, the Israelis, they are not allowing the food to get in. They allowed a little bit because there is more pressure right now in Israel, especially shifting a little politically to try to open, but it's not enough. All what the aid organization, all our organization or many other organizations, they are doing the aid. We are not covering 10% of the people needs in Gaza Strip. So you speak about 90% of the needs is still missing in Gaza Strip. And this is the disaster. This is why we have a mass starvation in Gaza Strip.
Thank you, Ziad. It's a dire situation, and it's, emphasizes the importance of ceasefire negotiations starting to gain some traction as soon as possible, because under those circumstances,
Right.
we at least know that we'll be able to get some of those trucks in. I'm wondering, we're going to have Nathaniel come on in a minute to talk a little bit about the system of detention. And Samar and I were talking last week about some of the terms of ceasefire and some of the lack of clarity on, what Hamas is looking for, what the position of the US and Israel actually is. And then, of course, one of the most unheard voices is the, regular folks in Palestine, as they are dealing with and contending with not only the bombing, but also as everything you've described just now. I'm wondering if you can tell us about, what you can tell us about the impact of detention on Palestinians in Gaza and throughout Palestine, and how they might view prisoner releases as part of a ceasefire deal. Is this something that people have an understanding about, that they have a position on? Is it widely accepted that this is critical to a ceasefire negotiation? But would be curious, particularly at this stage in where the crisis conditions are so dire, how Palestinians in Palestine might be viewing ceasefire negotiations and in particular, any notion of prisoner releases.
Yeah, actually, when it comes to prisoners, Palestinian prisoners, this is one of the most sensitive issues for Palestinian community. So all the time, like, even if you go back to the history, since 1948, there is the exchange of prisoners. It was with the Arab countries, but after, and Israel with the Egyptian, with the Syrian, and Palestinian prisoners, they were in the middle with that. But after 1967, when Israel occupied, conquered West Bank and Gaza Strip, and Golan Heights, Sinai, and Palestinian revolution take different kind of direction and the armed struggle against Israel, where they were like, when they capture some Israeli soldiers, even sometimes bodies of the Israeli soldiers, where they were trying to exchange prisoners. But when I say it's very sensitive issues, because we speak since 1967 until now, like if we take the numbers, how many Palestinian people they were arrested, especially speak about like West Bank and Gaza Strip, we have almost 1 million people experience the prison, men and women, they were arrested. And of course, some of them actually, they were arrested more than 20 times, especially when you speak about the activists, but others, they were spending in jail for a long time. Right now, we have prisoners, they are in jail over 40 years. They are not allowed to be released. And some of the people actually released last year, they spent 42 years. They are cousins actually from 1948. In any case, prisoners issue for the Palestinian, Israel will, it's not like any other country where they have special occasion to release the prisoners. So part of the blackmailing for Palestinian people and part how to punish the Palestinian people, the collective punishment. They are not just punishing the prisoners, they are punishing their community, they are punishing their families. So for the Palestinian, all the time, if there is any opportunity to exchange the prisoners, they do that. There were many, many, many in the history. We need special presentation about the history of exchange of prisoners. But I can say two major exchange of prisoners with Israel, with Palestinian groups. We have the first one, it was actually in 1985. It was on May 20th, 1985, when 1,150 prisoners released. I was living in the camp, in the Hesha camp. And this is the moment I can say all our history as Palestinian is related all the time to the sacrifice, where people living with sadness surrounding you. But this is the moment I will never forget, when everyone was in the street welcoming these heroes. These are the freedom fighters. These are our leaders in 1985. We were young, but Palestine all over with this 1,150 prisoners released. The other one, it was in October with Gilad Shalit. He was captured during 2008, 2009, sorry, in 2006, and released him actually in October 2011. And it was 1,027 prisoners in exchange for him. And this is the way how Palestinians release their own prisoners. Israel, they put the Palestinian prisoners in different categories. It depends what they accusation they accuse them, but all Palestinian prisoners, they are freedom fighters. Right now, each time they attack Gaza, the prisoners issue there in the negotiation. And it's a key element for ceasefire right now. For the Palestinian, all the time they want to release these prisoners, because as I said, you have over 500 prisoners. They are already spent over 35 years in a prison. And still you have, like, if you want to go with each category, you have many Palestinian prisoners. Right now, since I can say, even including with the October 7th, we have 7,600 prisoners since October 7th until now. But all the total of the Palestinian political prisoners until now, they are over 11,000. Every day they arrest people. This is one of the news every morning. When I wake up, I check the news, who was arrested last night in different parts of Palestine. Add to that the prisoners in Gaza, this is no one focused that much on them. You have thousands of people, they are arrested since October 7th. They are in special jails. Even there is no report about them. No Red Cross can visit them. No lawyers, no visit. 2 days ago, Haaretz newspaper actually came, and it's a big scandal actually, but the world, they are not paying attention for that. That 27 prisoners of them, they were assassinated, they were killed. They were captured, tortured, and we don't know how they were killed. But as a result of that, the people, they assume human rights under torture. And some of them just, they assassinated them, they killed them. So for the Palestinian as demanding on that, yeah, it's a need where we need to release these prisoners. And this is how the history with Israel. Israelis, they know that. They know that very well, that it's coming. They will be exchanged prisoners soon or later for that. And for the Palestinian, yeah, this is the way. Right now in the negotiation, there are main demands for the Palestinian is they want the Israelis to be outside of Gaza, the Israeli army. Second, they allow the people to move. The people, they are disabled, displaced, and they move. They can be able to return back. Even Gaza is destroyed, but they want the people to move. And the third demand is that they allow the aid to get into Gaza. And the fourth demand is to exchange the prisoners and release the Palestinian prisoners. And one of the things I want to mention, I know this is a long subject, Israel never honored any agreement to exchange prisoners. Like with Gilad Shalit, there are hundreds of prisoners. They were released, they returned back, and they arrested them.
Ziad. Yeah, and I think that's I'm grateful for that context, because I think that is going to have a big impact on how people view the terms of a ceasefire, particularly prisoner exchanges, given what you've said about the frequency of rearrest, particularly for those who are political prisoners, who are,
just want to
as
say
all
one
of them
thing.
are. Yeah.
Can I add one thing?
Yeah,
Sorry.
please.
Yeah, one of the things, like Israel, since October 7th, they announced they are in emergency, whatever they call it. All what Palestinian accomplished in a prison, the Palestinian political prisoners movement, they are very strong. They had many protests. What they used, the main weapon in prison, it's the hunger strike. And they accomplished certain kind of demands related to their daily life inside the prison and related to their communication with their families. What Israel has did since October 7th, all what the Palestinian political prisoners achieved in the history of the prisoners movement, which you speak since 1948, all what they achieved, it's gone. Israel is now treating them in different way. Like every prisoner, everywhere, in every prison, women, children, men, etc., they are treated in very fascist way. Like they are not allowed to sleep well. Most of them, they are not allowed to have a visit. Most of them, they are not eating well, punishing them in every level. Even sometimes just they punish, beating them just to the sake of beating them. So this is like where Israel is revenging from them. One of the things that we speak, of course, there are many reports reported to United Nations right now about women sexually harassed, not only men, women actually, and men. And now they are doing the investigation in United Nations, which Palestinian women arrested from Gaza and from West Bank, they are sexually harassed. Some of them even reach the level of rape to blackmail these women. This is something ongoing, and this is what's make all the people, Palestinian families, they are worried. It's not just the people they are killed in Gaza. I know the people focus on genocide, on what's going on in Gaza, but on the other side, there is the slow genocide taking different kind of direction inside the prison. The number of the Palestinian prisoners we speak about, 10, they were killed in the prisons in West Bank, and now we speak about 27, the report is coming. But I assume, and many other organizations, we assume that the number is much bigger than this number right now, because Israel, they don't announce anything.
Yeah, thank you so much for that background, and it's a great segue into what I think Nathaniel will talk about. Just a reminder to everyone, we dropped a link in the chat for so you can follow Mecca for Peace and Ziad's work and support the amazing work that they're doing on the ground, especially in Rafah. And we want to thank you again, Ziad, for joining us and for sharing your wisdom and insight. And I think it would be great to also follow up with you in the near future around talking a little bit about that history of prisoner swaps and exchanges and what that tells us about what to expect moving forward. But thanks again for joining us today again.
Thank you.
So before we close out, I want to welcome Nathaniel Moore from Freedom Archives. And what Nathaniel will be talking about with us today will be a little bit of a background on the apparatus of imprisonment and the machinery of imprisonment across Palestine, and a little bit more of a structural sort of analysis and overview of what Ziad has just talked about with us today. Nathaniel, thanks for joining us.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me, Thomas. Appreciate being here.
So, Nathaniel, I want to just jump into it and make sure we make the best use of our time. We just heard from Ziad about some of the considerations for Palestinians regarding hostage releases, some of the history, some of the brutal reality, the fascistic violence that happens internally. And I know, you have a long history with Freedom Archives of doing prisoner solidarity work with Palestine. Can you tell us a little bit about, just taking a step back, what does the overview look like on the role of imprisonment in Palestine and how it functions?
Sure. So, I mean, Ziad did a really wonderful job of kind of, providing a lot of in-depth information. So I'm just going to create a little bit of an umbrella for folks who might not know a lot about the background topic. As with many places, imprisonment is used to traumatize people and destroy the fabric of communities. And so that's obviously relevant in terms of Palestine. Israelis specifically use imprisonment to repress anti-colonial struggle and political organizing. And obviously, in terms of the history of the occupation in Palestine, the physical control of Palestinians and their movement has been a huge part of the expanding occupation. And so in addition to things like checkpoints and apartheid walls, actual incarceration is a way to physically control populations and their movements. Ziad mentioned some of this stuff, but other things that come to mind, you see stats like, 1 in 5 Palestinians during their lives spend some time in prison. Almost 1 million political prisoners since 1967. Numbers vary, but today I think there's over 9,000 in terms of whatever count is taking place. But all of the speakers have mentioned in terms of conditions on the ground, it's hard to get solid numbers. Israel is the only country in the world that tries children in military courts, and it's useful to know that all Palestinians are tried in Israeli criminal courts. There's no, or Israeli military courts. There's no criminal legal justice system for Palestinians. One other, I want to talk about 2 very specific pieces of the apparatus, and then flip it a little bit and talk, amplify kind of the significance of this to Palestinians. One unique part of the apparatus is the Israeli policy of administrative detention, which essentially is secret information that they use to imprison people without due process. All that takes place, again, in military court. That information does not need to be made known. And in fact, in military court procedures, Israeli prosecutors can actually create their own evidence and as recreation of what happened, and then submit that as evidence. And I've seen that happen, in fact. Another piece of the administrative detention is it allows you to be detained for a certain specific period without charges. And then oftentimes, and again, this was mentioned before, detainees will then be released and within the next couple days rearrested. And so, in terms of sometimes you'll see these numbers where there'll be these huge swap deals, but then following them, there'll be these huge rearrests. And so, many, many people who were actually freed during the swaps will then find themselves again incarcerated. Another specific and unique piece of the apparatus is home demolitions. So in terms of some of the updates we've been hearing about what's happening in Gaza, clearly the idea of collective punishment has been raised a number of times. So home demolitions, if my family member is accused of is either accused or incarcerated or convicted of something, then in fact my home could be destroyed. And so again, this is not only a way for the fabric of society to continuously be under attack, but also, heightens the repression so that people who, may want to participate in movements for their own liberation and justice might think twice because of the impact that it has on their families, or just, again, creates this huge networks of destruction in communities for no reason whatsoever. People who have nothing to do with anything get, caught up in these things. I want to, now that I've blown through that information, I want to just take a moment and kind of flip it, because in fact, I think that I don't just want to look at this as ways in which Israel represses Palestine. I want to look at this in ways that the Palestinian political prisoners lead their movements, and that in fact, political imprisonment is a key site of Palestinian resistance. So because so many folks are locked up, prisons become education centers, ways to build solidarity and unity. If you travel around Palestine, you will consistently see not only images of martyrs, but also of, people who have been locked up. And, Ziad mentioned, right, one of the days that he remembers the most in terms of his childhood was a day where all the political prisoners came home. So that stands for itself as the significance in which these folks play in their communities. And the Israelis know that. And so even though they've said that they've discontinued this policy, I did want to raise that for many, many years, they had a military policy called the Hannibal Directive, which was essentially them saying that they would rather kill their own people to avoid them falling into Palestinian hands. Because if they do fall into Palestinian hands, essentially they're going to have to negotiate for a prisoner swap and release Palestinian prisoners. And so there are numerous examples within the 30 some years that this was on the books of literally them killing their own people so that they don't have to negotiate with Palestinians. Supposedly this policy is over, but I think we've seen evidence following October 7th that there's aspects of this that are still very much so in play, and certainly in the consciousness of how the Israeli military functions. The last thing that I just want to touch upon, and I know that we're at the very end here, is imprisonment is so endemic in the ways in which that Israel maintains the occupation and represses Palestinians, that you have folks drawn from all sectors of society. So if you were to look at people who are incarcerated in Palestine, you would find youth and students, you would find artists, political and military leaders. You would also find people like human rights defenders, like lawyers. You would find people like democratically elected Palestinian representatives. You also, I want to just bring attention to, if you're a member of an organization that's been banned, so I believe it was last spring, that Israel banned 6 human rights organizations in Palestine. If you're affiliated with those organizations, you too could be arrested. And again, because I mentioned administrative detention and secret orders, in fact, you can be arrested for anything. And so the demographic of people in prison is so wide and robust, it actually covers all sectors of Palestinians. And again, that's one of the reasons why such leadership and unity is derived from prisoners, because in fact, it's not sectarian, it's not about political affiliation, it's really much more of the fabric of society. I'll just say one last thing in my 1 minute and then throw it over to Thomas. There's been tons of work that's happened in support of Palestinian political prisoners in the Bay, long history predating myself. But one thing that is happening in the near future is some folks are creating a solidarity mural with political prisoners in Palestine. There's an event at Eastside on Sunday that you can learn more about. It's at 2 p.m. Don't hesitate to join the space and to check it out. Apologies for the information dump, and thanks so much for having me, Thomas.
No, of course, Nathaniel, thanks so much. As you know, this is your first time here. We tend to pack a lot in, and we don't get to spend all the time we want with everyone. I could have talked with Deanne and you at greater length, but appreciate you getting through all that. If you could drop any links in the chat so people can join the event on the mural this weekend, that would be great. Before we go, just one programming note. Thank you all for sticking with us. We have just a nice announcement about next week's PSA call. We'll be joined by Noura Erakat next week as a special guest. So we may switch up the agenda a little bit. We'll probably still do some quick update with Samer and then spend the balance of our time in conversation with Noura. And we're grateful for her joining us next week. And hopefully we'll talk a little bit more with her about her perspective on ceasefire negotiations and some of her expectations about the road ahead. As usual, thank you all for joining us. And again, for those who can, please join the Women's March this afternoon at the Civic Center in San Francisco. And till then, we'll see you in the streets. Thanks a lot.